All right, so we are starting our level 3 sessions now with behavioral finance. This is study session 3, and we are doing the first reading in study session 3, which is the behavioral finance perspective. Now, as a general point here, we have a short introduction. And then so these are basically the 4 sections in this reading. Then we'll talk about behavioral versus traditional perspectives, how people make decisions, both in the classical traditional sense and then in the behavioral finance sense. And then we'll talk about perspectives on market behavior and portfolio construction, both from a traditional sense and a behavioral sense. Now, the reason I find this reason fascinating is up till now in level 1 and level 2, you have been inundated with traditional finance knowledge. So you have been learning about efficient market hypothesis. You have learned about what Mr. Markowitz said. So you talk about these elaborate portfolios that are constructed based on standard finance theory or traditional finance theory. You have talked about things like Bayes' theorem. But the question is, how many people in the real world actually use this stuff? How many people have actually used Bayes' theorem to really update probabilities based on new information? Anybody in this room? Probably not, probably very few. There are some academic geeks who will do that. But normal people don't necessarily do all the things that you learn about in traditional or classic finance. So we are starting level 3 by looking at a different perspective, looking at how normal people operate. And I use normal in a very special sense here. What traditional finance does, and what do we mean by traditional finance? This is what you study in your regular finance courses. So the sorts of things that Markowitz said, or the sorts of things that people like Fema and French said, efficient market hypothesis, all that is your traditional finance or your theoretical finance. Now, if you remember, the sorts of assumptions made in traditional finance basically rely on people being rational. So people looking at all sorts of scenarios, evaluating scenarios carefully, and then making the most optimal, most rational decision. So the assumption is that people are rational. However, what behavioral finance says is that people don't necessarily act rationally, but people just act like people. People act like normal people. Now, those of you how many people are familiar with Star Trek? Okay, now, I might be dating myself, but because of the recent Star Trek movie, I can assume that even the younger people are familiar with Star Trek. So I don't think anybody has put it this way, but I will. Traditional finance assumes that investors are like Spock. All right, so evaluate every scenario carefully. So given his Vulcan background, he is a totally rational, not semi-human being, right? So he evaluates every scenario and then operates based on what is logical and what is rational. But normal people are more like Captain Kirk in the sense that there is some rationalism involved, but there is also emotion. There are other variables involved beyond pure reason and logic, right? And that's how human beings react. That's how human beings are. So if that's how human beings are, investors are also human. So that means investors also will have some emotion involved in their decisions. So does it then not make sense to understand those emotions, understand that psychology and so on? And that effectively is what behavioral finance tries to do. Okay, so that's the introduction. Now, from an exam perspective, you need to be able to understand the differences and contrasts between behavioral finance and traditional finance. So I put together this basic slide. We are now on section 2 in the curriculum. So what is traditional finance? So the terms traditional finance, standard finance, theoretical finance are all synonymous and used interchangeably. So as I hope that this material on the left is material that is very familiar to you, given that you have cleared the first 2 levels of the CFA program. Okay, so individuals are risk averse. You've learned that. Who said that? Whose assumption was this? So this was Markowitz's assumption. Individuals are utility maximizing. Okay, so people try to maximize their wealth. Modigliani and Miller came up with arbitrage principles, which implied that if an arbitrage opportunity is there, people will take advantage, and because of the arbitrage principle, you will avoid mispricing issues. You studied Markowitz's portfolio principles. This is where you studied the efficient frontier and the capital market line and the optimal portfolio and so on. Okay, but then how many of you construct the efficient frontier when you are deciding what to buy? Okay, if you do, let me know. You studied CAPM, all right, and then you studied as an option pricing theory to some extent at level 2. But anyway, these are the pillars of traditional finance. And actually, any finance program in the world will cover these items. Behavioral finance is a little bit different. So rather than take these theoretical constructs, what behavioral finance tries to do is come up with theories based on what people actually do. So they look at actual investor behavior, actual market behavior, and try to understand and try to explain that. All right. So behavioral finance challenges the rational investor assumption. So behavioral finance basically says that investors are not like Mr. Spock. They are normal, but not necessarily rational. Okay, and then we'll get into more detail. So make a note of this. This is important. So one core tenet here is that people are not necessarily rational. People are just acting like people. So acting normal. Behavioral finance also challenges the efficient market hypothesis. And the final 2 points on this are actually items that are covered in subsequent reading, but within behavioral finance, we have the concept of behavioral finance micro, which deals with these psychological and behavioral issues at a micro level. So when we talk about something like loss aversion, so as human beings, we don't like risk, but what we really don't like is the risk of loss. If I have a risk that maybe my portfolio will go up by 50% or maybe it will go up by 100%, do I have a problem with that? Probably not. What I have a problem with is loss. Okay, now this is an example of a person-specific or an investor-specific issue. So these investor-specific items fall within behavioral finance micro, and behavioral finance macro deals with behavioral issues at a macro level, at a market level. And these are items that are just briefly introduced in this first reading and then covered in more detail in subsequent readings. Okay, now section 2.1 in the curriculum, traditional finance perspectives on individual behavior. Now again, I feel this is a good point to start because this connects with what you have studied at the first 2 levels of the CFA program. So according to traditional finance, we have rational investors, and what do rational investors do? They make decisions consistent with utility theory. So you look at various options and then you pick the option that maximizes your personal utility. You pick the option that makes you most happy. According to traditional finance, you also revise expectations using Bayes' formula. Now, if you thought you'll never see Bayes' formula again after level 1, think again, because there is an example here on Bayes' formula. Now, I don't think there'll be any detailed question on Bayes' formula, but you still need to understand. So anyway, the point here is that in theory, a rational investor will say that, okay, if there is a certain probability of a certain event, and then he gets some new information, what should a rational investor do? He should update the probability of the event given the new information. So that's rational. Okay. Now, traditional finance also talks about this utility theory, which I mentioned here. So let's talk in a little more detail about utility theory. So utility theory says that investors maximize their utility or happiness. Nothing wrong with that. Now we'll talk about it in a little more detail, but first just understand the basic axioms of utility theory. Do you know what axioms mean? Yeah, axioms means assumptions, or actually more specifically it means assumptions that you assume to be true. So axioms. Now very briefly, you need to understand these 4 axioms, and you can follow along with me again, section 2.1 in the curriculum. So what does the axiom of completeness mean? It means that as an investor or as any human being, given choices A and B, you will be very clear whether you prefer A or prefer B, or if you are indifferent to A and B. So if A represents one bundle, such as tea and samosa, and bundle B is coffee and donut, you are going to be very clear about which one you prefer. You can't say that if I am with my South Asian friends, I prefer tea and samosa. If I am with my American friends, I prefer coffee and donut. That would be a violation of the axiom of completeness. You need to be consistent and clear about what bundle you prefer. Okay, that's for but do people change? In the real world, people can have different preferences depending on the environment they are in. What does transitivity mean? So transitivity means that if you have 3 bundles, A, B and C, so if you prefer A over B and you prefer B over C, then this means that you must prefer A over C. Okay, so that's the principle of transitivity. The axiom of independence says the following. So this says that if you have option A and you have option B and you prefer A to B, then if you add a third option or a third item C, then A plus, let's say, 50% of C will be preferred to B plus 50% of C. Does this look logical? So again, this is an assumption of the utility theory. And then the principle of continuity effectively says that if you have indifference curves where you basically show your preference between 2 items, I don't know if you remember this or not, but if you have indifference curve between A and B, this principle says that these curves need to be continuous. Now you don't need to get too hung up with the details over here. As long as you understand the 1 or 2 lines about each axiom that I've given you, that's good enough. Okay, now Bayes formula. So this is actually example 1 in the curriculum. I'm not going to give you a long lecture on Bayes formula because I really doubt that you will get a full-fledged question on it. Even the LOS doesn't emphasize this. There are just the following points that you need to know. You need to remember that Bayes formula is a formula that you use to come up with a updated probability of an event. Now, I'm going to, those of you who have seen my level 1 stuff, basically I'm going to use the symbols that we used at level 1. So let's say that you have a given event and now there is some new information that has come in. So probability of event given new information is what? It is the probability of the event that you originally had before the information came in, multiplied by probability of information given event, and this is what threw most people off, but hopefully you roughly recall this from level 1, divided by, does anyone remember? PIE. It's actually probability of information. Okay, so again, as I said, I don't think there'll be a full-fledged question on this, but what you need to recognize is that this is the formula that's used to update your probabilities given new information. And if you are feeling really brave, you go back and work through example 1, which essentially uses this formula. The symbols are slightly different, but the format and the mechanism and the thought process is the same. All right. Now, traditional finance assumes that we are all rational economic men. Now, at the time this was put forward, everyone was a man, so that's why it's called rational economic man. So what will a rational economic man try to do? He will try to obtain the highest possible utility given budget constraints and given available information. So this sounds rational, and a rational person will only consider personal utility. So philanthropy is not in the scope of your traditional finance. It doesn't make sense that Bill Gates will give his whole riches away to help solve medical issues in Africa. Not explained by traditional finance. Okay. Now, in terms of risk aversion, what does traditional finance say? Exactly. Traditional finance says that investors are risk averse. So just as a quick refresher on risk aversion, if you plot utility on the y-axis and wealth on the x-axis, according to traditional finance, if you are risk neutral, then this line will be like this, straight. If you are risk averse, then if you have wealth on the x-axis and utility on the y-axis, you will have a diminishing returns. So as you keep getting richer and richer, according to traditional finance, the utility of wealth reaches diminishing returns. But again, in the real world, is this necessarily true? If you look at some of the politicians in our part of the world, does it seem like their utility for wealth starts diminishing after they reach a certain level? Probably not. So for them, it actually looks something like that. Right? So this would be actually, in traditional finance, this is actually a risk-loving or a risk-seeking graph. So wealth on this axis, utility, this is risk-seeking. So traditional finance says that this is the way people will behave. All right, now what does behavioral finance say? Behavioral finance, first of all, challenges this whole concept of a rational economic man. Why? Because human beings don't necessarily just act on logic and reason. What human beings do also depends on fear, love, hate, pleasure, pain. So what are all these? These are all emotions, right? So and if you look into yourself, does your behavior sometimes stem from your emotion? It does, right? So that's how human beings act. Now, human beings have inner conflicts. In an economic context, what might that conflict be? Now, you know that if you have some money, it is in your long-term interest to save that money and, maybe pay for your child's education later or buy a better house after 10 years. But some people might want to use that money to go on a wonderful vacation or buy a brand new car or do something like that, where essentially, based on an impulse or based on an emotion, you are making a short-term decision that's not maximizing your long-term well-being. Does that happen? So with most normal human beings, that does happen. So behavioral finance again challenges that people are simply acting rationally. Then traditional finance assumes that we have a lot of information, we almost have full information, and we are smart enough to use that full information in a proper way. Is that true? There are two problems with that. A, we don't always have full information. B, we are not necessarily smart enough to analyze that information the way we should. Okay, so now to deal with those two limitations, we'll have a theory called bounded rationality theory, which we will talk about. All right. Now, traditional finance talks about this concept of utility maximization. So what does this mean? So if I give you a very simple picture, so if you have a trade-off between two goods, A and B, what does this whole utility maximization say? Now these are your utility curves. So if you can only trade off between A and B, you have utility curves that maybe look like this. So what does a utility curve tell you? A utility curve, actually these are also called indifference curves. So as you move along these, you are moving between different ratios of A and B. And the indifference curve tells you that on a given indifference curve, you are indifferent between any combination on that curve. So traditional utility maximization says that you try to draw these utility curves. Now, which one would you prefer? Where are you happier? The further up you go, the happier you are. Now, which utility curve will you be on? You will be on the one, now you will also have a budget constraint, right? So this is your budget constraint line. So you will try to end up on the utility curve that is the highest and that meets your budget constraint. So this is what your traditional finance theory says. But what does behavioral finance say? If you look at Exhibit 3 in the curriculum, you are given this example. Let's say that your constraint is that you have 10 hours in a day, and you can split these 10 hours between work and leisure. Okay, so this is hours of leisure, and this is hours of work. All right, now traditional finance will try to say the following. It will say that, okay, you create an indifference curve that's like this. And it will say that, okay, if you have 10 hours, then the following two scenarios will make you equally happy. So 4 hours at work and 6 hours of leisure time will make you as happy as, say, 3 hours of leisure and 7 hours of work. So that's what traditional finance will say. But what's the counterpoint? And this is articulated well towards the end of this segment in the curriculum. First of all, most normal people do not define these mathematical equations and graphs and curves and figure out what's the optimal point. Okay, so that's one counterpoint. Another counterpoint is that this theory, this traditional theory, does not take into account risk aversion. So for example, if you are the really risk averse sort, and you are the sort that worries that if I work 1 hour less, I might get fired. Do you know people like that? Probably do. So this sort of traditional finance does not explain that behavior. What about exogenous factors? So for example, if you are in a state of the economy where unemployment is high, do you prize or value your job or value your work more? You do. So how does this model incorporate those exogenous factors? So the traditional model does not. Now, fortunately for us, the curriculum doesn't go into too much detail about these behavioral finance elements. You just need to know that people don't necessarily act in the rational way that traditional finance tells you. And as a side remark, even at level 3, in study session 3, you are given this other perspective, but then the rest of the curriculum is back to traditional finance. So you are just they essentially put something in your brain that you need to think about normal people, and once you have it in your brain, then you go back to traditional finance. All right, what about attitude towards risk? What's our traditional view of attitude towards risk? Now, as we said, the traditional view is that investors are risk averse. So now when you draw utility curves, you need to be very careful about what's the x-axis and what's the y-axis. And just as a side remark, sometimes you see utility curves between two goods A and B which look like this. But if we are drawing utility curves where you have, say, income on the x-axis, so let's say income in the curriculum is denoted by a Z, and utility is denoted by how happy you are. Risk-averse people will have a curve that looks like this, where as you have more and more income, the incremental utility of that income is diminishing, so diminishing returns. This is the traditional view. What is the behavioral view? The behavioral view says that our attitude to risk is reference dependent. It's not just one attitude to risk. The attitude to risk depends on our level of wealth, and maybe, so essentially it depends to some extent on wealth. So for example, we might be risk seekers for some level of wealth, and we might be risk averse for other levels of wealth. A classic example of this is lottery tickets. Are they popular? They are. Can they be explained through rational behavior? If you do an expected value on a lottery ticket, it will invariably be negative. But yet, millions of people buy lottery tickets. Why? Because maybe if you are told that you are going to put, there's a low probability, but there's a low probability that you can make a ton of money. That tends to make people risk-loving or risk-seeking. Okay, but there might be other levels of wealth at which people are risk-averse. So whether you are risk-averse or risk-loving depends on the level of wealth at stake or the returns that are at stake. So the example given in the curriculum or what's pointed out is this concept of a double inflection utility function. Double inflection, this is exhibit 4. So this is one theory. So one theory is that at relatively low levels of wealth, people are risk averse. So again, this is the income or Z on the x-axis and utility at the y-axis. So people at low levels of wealth are relatively risk averse. Then there is a certain level where people become risk loving or risk seeking. And then again, once you are very rich, then you become risk averse again. Now, is this necessarily true? I don't know. It's just a theory. And if you hear this concept of double inflection utility function, this is it. Why is this double inflection? Because there's one inflection happening over here where you are moving from risk averse to risk seeking. And then there is another inflection happening here where you are going from risk seeking to again risk averse. So again, I don't think you need to get hung up in the details. As long as you know these basic points, you are fine. Now this slide, and then I'll make you do some work. All right. Now behavioral finance also uses this concept of neuro-economics, and this is not explicitly a learning objective, and there are no examples here, so I think as long as you just know the very fundamental points, you are fine. So neuro-economics tries to explain how normal human beings make economic decisions, and it relies on multiple disciplines. So it relies, for example, on neuroscience. Do you know what neuroscience is? So you actually try to look at images of the brain, and you look at activity in the brain, and you look at the chemicals in the brain and try to understand how the chemicals in your brain influence your actions. Okay, so if you read this segment of the curriculum, you'll actually see names of chemicals in there, so it looks a bit like a chemistry course, but I can't imagine something like that being tested. As long as you know that neuroscience tries to use what's happening in the brain and images to explain how people will behave, that's all you need to know. And neuroscience also tries to use psychology and economics. Ultimate goal is to use all these disciplines to figure out how human beings will behave. Okay. Now, for those who are listening online and those who are over here, this is something I'll do. This reading has 4 learning objectives. And the learning objectives A, B, C, D are not necessarily aligned with the curriculum. My lecture is going to be aligned with the curriculum. So what I'm doing here is, the first learning objective covers material we've covered so far. So I want you to pause this video now and actually try to jot down what you have learnt. So contrast traditional and behavioral finance perspectives on investor decision making. Actually, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make 2 columns. And this is actually, I'm preparing you for the sorts of things you'll see on the exam. So on the left, do the traditional view. And on the right, do the behavioral finance view. And just try to put down all the things that you recall from traditional finance and then the things that you remember in terms of behavioral finance. Okay, so now we move on to section 3 in the curriculum, which talks about decision making. And this section 3 has 3 subparts. The first is generally going to talk about decision theory, how are decisions made. Then we talk about this concept of bounded rationality, which we've touched briefly before, but we'll talk about in a little more detail. And then the third part is a theory called prospect theory. And these are pretty important. So first, decision theory, and this is traditional. This is what you are somewhat familiar with. So in basic decision theory, if I were to just summarize it in a few words, what is it? So how do you make decisions between, say, A, B, and C? So if you are to, for example, tie back to corporate finance, and you have 3 projects where you need to pick one, what are you going to do? So for each project, you will try to come up with expected values of cash flows, for example. You will try to evaluate probabilities. You will try to evaluate other uncertainties and so on. And then you will combine these to come up with some sort of expected value. And then you will make an optimal decision. What was the optimal decision? To pick the project with the highest expected value. Okay, so this is what a rational person will do, and this is a quick summary of very basic decision theory, and I think that's the main point that you need to know here. But what are some issues with the basic theory? One basic issue is that the theory, basic decision theory, sort of assumes that we have a lot of information. So simplistically, it assumes that we have perfect information. But in the real world, we do not have perfect information. Another assumption is that we have the brains, the cognitive skills to be able to appropriately process all that information and come up with the best decisions. Again, that's probably not true. So this theory of bounded rationality relaxes those 2 assumptions. So it recognizes the fact that we don't have perfect information. It recognizes the fact that we don't have the cognitive skills, the intellectual skills to properly process all information. So by relaxing these 2 constraints, we come up with a theory called bounded rationality. And this is how many normal people operate. So I'll give you my real life example. So some time ago, I decided to buy some stocks in Pakistan. Now, what would be the rational thing to do? The rational thing would be to evaluate a whole long list of stocks, look at cash flows, look at PE ratios, look at all the things that I teach at level 1 and level 2, and then figure out which is the most appropriate stock to buy given my risk-return profile. Okay, do you think I did that? I did not do that. Here is what I did. What I did was I said, okay, right now the stock market doesn't seem overly priced or underpriced. So in general, the PE ratio is appropriate given historical levels. Now that I'm a little older, I want to buy stocks that are relatively safe. So I spoke to some friends who I trust in the market, and then I decided to buy Hapco and Fauji Fertilizer because they are 2 well-known stocks, give good dividends. My friends who work at advisory firms suggested that I go for them. So I bought them. Now, was that the most rational decision? Probably not. It was an adequate decision in the sense that did I waste too much time? No. Did I make a reasonable choice? I did. Okay, I'm quite happy I made that decision. So essentially what I did is, in the limited time that I had, I used the available information. I used heuristics. Heuristics is shortcuts, rules of thumb. Okay, so for example, my rule of thumb was that my safe stock is a stock that has a decent market capitalization and pays a decent dividend. Okay, that's a heuristic. So I used the available information, I used heuristics, and I made my decision. So was my decision optimal? Maybe not. Maybe I could have found something better. But was it adequate? It was. So bounded rationality allows you to make adequate decisions that might not be optimal. Okay, and this word that is created in this context is a word called satisfies. So the decision that I made, I was satisfied with the decision given the information that I had, and it was sufficient given what I wanted to accomplish. All right, so somebody put these 2 words together and came up with this 3rd word. Now, what you need to do very quickly is read through example 2. So you have some money to invest short term. So you have an investor here who has some money to invest short term, and what does he do? Do you think he should go and look at every single bank and look at the returns that he can get in every single bank? Or does it make sense that he just goes to the nearest bank, verifies that it's a good reputable bank and puts his money there. Okay, that's what he did. Was he making an optimal decision? Maybe not. Is he making an adequate decision that most normal people would do? Probably. Okay, so this theory is bounded rationality. Now, I want you to just pause the video here and listen to and read through example 2. So it gives a good illustration of bounded rationality. All right, so now what you need to do is list or just quickly discuss. This is learning objective C. So in the curriculum sequence they've skipped B, that will come later. So discuss the effects of cognitive and knowledge capacity limitations on investment decision making. So what's the first thing that you've learned? When we remove these constraints, when we recognize that our cognitive ability is limited, and we recognize that our knowledge and our information is limited, what's the theory that we then come up with? What's the theory that we use? So so you need to know that theory, bounded rationality. And what I want you to do very quickly to demonstrate that you've understood what I said over the last 10 minutes. So can you jot down the main points of bounded rationality?